So it's a pleasure to be here today, and I'll spend some time talking about BaaS and what Stanchart is doing in that space. But before I get into that, a little advertisement about the bank. If some of you don't know who Stanchart is, we are one of the oldest, or the oldest operating retail bank in the country today. Yeah, we've been here for about 148 years. We operate in about 50 plus odd markets across the world, and in about 30 odd plus markets in the retail bank space. Yeah. So generally when I meet people in Malaysia, and I've been here for a good 17 years now, generally they say, oh, I remember Stanchart because of the Donald Duck. Yeah, see, he remembers. I'm sure you're not very young, because that was meant for kids 30 years ago, I presume. I have seen that coin box though, it's pretty sturdy. Some people have still kept it as a great memory. So people remember us for the Donald Duck. People remember us for being big, bold, and friendly. And now some people have started adding boring. Right? Traditional bank, you guys are very boring and stuff. And that can't be further from the truth. The reality is we are fairly courageous and bold in how we operate and how we do things. Just to give you some examples, we are, I guess, if not the only, I think we're the only bank today in markets like Hong Kong and Singapore who have launched our own digital banks. So we are fairly prominent in those markets. In Hong Kong, we're big enough to even print currencies today, by the way. If you go to Hong Kong and take a Hong Kong dollar, you'll see it's printed by Standard Chartered, right? But we have gone and launched digital banks, and not yesterday. Hong Kong Digital Bank was launched pre-COVID. It's been running for 4 years. We expect to break even, I think, or start making profits in the next year or so. Singapore is more popular, closer to home here. We launched Trust, which is one of the fastest growing digital banks in the world today. Right? So between these two digital banks, we already have about 1 million clients. We have also got into the partnership space and platform space in different areas, right? Another example, which is coming to Malaysia soon, is Solve, which is one of our platforms or a marketplace for SMEs. Embedded Finance, which is in public news, Atomy, right? And of course, the BaaS ventures in Indonesia that have gone live with Bukalapak, right? That's about a platform with 100 million clients. So there's a lot of action in which Stanchart has been involved, and there's a little more funky stuff too. People who are into the crypto world, we have our own custodian services now, right? We are working with a fintech on which we invested, and we launched those services too. It's a lot of innovation. And why are we doing that? Because we believe that if we want to be relevant in the banking space and serve our clients well, we'll have to keep innovating and stay abreast with technology and see what's happening around us and adapt to that. And there are many reasons for doing all of that. But to be more precise and specific for today's topic, BaaS, right? Banking as a service. Why did Stanchart get into the space? So there's a brilliant man who apparently is listening to this call, and he'll give me a vote later whether I spoke well about BaaS or not. There's Kelvin Tan, who's the kind of architect of BaaS within the Stanchart world. He set up this entity practically, and he runs his company as a CEO today called Odex, which is our BaaS venture. So the problem statement we have been grappling with as a bank for the longest of time is, how do we scale up? So although we operate in about 30 odd markets in the retail banking space, we are significantly prominent and big in markets like Hong Kong, Singapore, right? In other markets like Malaysia and all, we're pretty good, we're profitable, we do well, but we are prominent only in certain client subsegments which we chose to participate more actively in. For example, affluent. So if you look at our capabilities on the affluent side today in the market, into the platform solutioning, it's cutting edge, best in class. But the problem statement always has been in the personal banking space. How do you grow? How do you scale up? How do you become a player which has enough size? How do you bring in more clients? Now the simpler answer could be, yeah, why don't you go and open a few hundred branches? Easy, right? That's what you've been doing for hundreds of years, so we know how to do that very well. Why don't you go deploy feet on the street of another few thousand people? Easy solution again, we know how to do that, right? But the challenge with those solutions are, they're very, very, very expensive, right? And client preferences have changed. So the previous panel was talking about who goes to a branch. Vincent said, I only go to a branch when I'm upset. Right? Thank God he doesn't come to a Stanchart branch ever, but I hope he banks with me. And that's the reality, right? So nobody wants to go to a branch. I go to a branch because I work in a bank, just to visit the team, right? I doubt anybody sitting here otherwise goes to a branch anymore. And that's reality. So client preferences are changing. So scale is the biggest problem we were grappling with and trying to solve for. How do we really scale up, right? But scale up in an efficient fashion, which is sustainable. Scale up with much, much lower cost of acquisition. So instead of spending $100 to acquire a client, how do we do that in $10? So that was the problem statement. And the solution we took upon is BaaS. So that's the context of why we got into this journey. Now, again, you could argue, okay, why would you want to go and create a separate platform for this? Why can't you use the current banking stacks? So people who are from the tech world will understand, being traditional old banks, our banking stacks are also very traditional and old, right? We have been operating on the same stacks for almost, I guess, 20, 30, 40 years, depending on how old the bank is and how old the stack is. Can I take that and say, let's talk to a platform and connect with an open API? We can talk. It won't happen though, right? So we had to invest in technology for that. And hence, we invested in the stack, and this journey started a few years ago where we said, okay, let's start putting in money in building a new stack which is nimbler, scalable, open architecture, and then we can plug in to work with partners. So that's fundamentally to give you some context of how we started this journey. Now to refer to my notes again. Give me a second. Okay. The other aspect that we were looking at here, right, while we got into this, is clients. So while we could invest in technology, which is potentially something relatively questionable but easy to do if you have the kind of money and the dollar to put behind it, it was also about how do you really go and scale up by getting access to clients. And this is where the whole piece around partnership came into play. That while we can go and create a strategy of launching digital banks in certain markets, if you look at those markets like Hong Kong and Singapore I mentioned earlier, where we are very successful, it is with good partners, right? Singapore is with NTUC, which is a household name there, if you understand Singapore well. So the idea was we work with partners, platforms who understand clients, platforms who have access to large client portfolios and client bases, and are also keen to build stickiness on their platforms in bringing the clients together. So that was fundamentally the two aspects we considered when we got into this space. Now, when we got into this space, then the question was, how do we implement, what do we do, and fundamentally build on this journey. So like I said, the investment started almost a few years ago, right, in building the platform. And if you take a step back, look at the structure of BaaS, fundamentally there are three different components or roles you will come across in terms of a traditional BaaS model. One is obviously you need a platform, a distributor, who will be the front for you, who will engage the client. So we are not doing it ourselves anymore, right? And why is that important to understand? Again, consumer behavior. Today, how many of you go and spend time on your banking app every day? A show of hands, how many of you go every day into your banking app and spend time on it? Just because you wake up in the morning, the first thing you want to log in is, hey, I want to log into my banking app and see what's happening. How many of you do that? Nobody, right? I'm not surprised, right? That's why we are struggling. Nobody wants to go to a banking app. Forget branch. Not a very exciting place to go, right? Unless suddenly you get a notification that you've got a free lucky draw from the bank worth some 100,000, or somebody took money out of your bank account. Then I guess you'll be worried. Otherwise, nobody logs in, right? How many of you go into your other apps, social media, TikTok, Facebook, whatever, depending on age and generation, I guess, or even shopping apps like Lazada and Shopee? So research shows general consumers are spending about 2 to 2.5 hours on these kind of apps in a day. Right? I don't know when they work. 2 to 2.5 hours. That's a significant amount of time they spend on these apps. Right? Banking apps, less than a few minutes. Logically so. Right? That's not surprising in that sense, right? So the role of a distributor here are these people who have these platforms, who have these consumers where they're coming in today, right? And you need to work with them and find them. The second is the enablers, which are fundamentally the tech providers to some extent, who will provide you the tech solutions to enable and connect the banks with these distributors, right? And the third is obviously the providers, the banks, who bring access to the licenses, if you want to operate and be like a bank, right? Who get you access to products and solutions in banking and who understand how to run this in a sustainable fashion. So what we chose to do is two things. We said, okay, we are a provider. That's our core job as a bank. But we'll also be the enabler to a great extent. So we do leverage on external technology, but we decided to invest ourselves on technology too, because we do have enough expertise in the bank and we have invested a lot in our innovation ventures, under SE ventures, right? And that's how Nexus was formed. And that's how we build this. So being the provider and being the enabler is where we came in. And then on the other side, we have the distributors who are the platforms. That's fundamentally how we brought this journey together, right? As I mentioned earlier, one good example here is Bukalapak in Indonesia, which is public knowledge, hence I can talk about it. A platform which is an e-commerce platform with about 100 odd million clients. We launched sometime this year. We have already tripled the Stanchart Indonesia's client base with this partnership. That should give you a sense. A bank that has been running for almost a 50-year period in the market has tripled the client base on account of this partnership. So that's the kind of scale you can garner when you get into partnerships of this nature. So having the right platform, technology, right product solutions, and the right partner makes a significant difference, right? We are doing the same in other markets too, including Malaysia. Now, for reasons of confidentiality, I can't talk about the partners and stuff at this point of time because the application is with the regulator, and fingers crossed, if all goes well, we should have the approval soon and potentially launch before the digital banks go live. No, we intend to, right? We have to. So that's to give you some sense here. Okay. Now, the other question that keeps coming up here is use cases. What do you want to do in this space? So traditional BaaS models which are starting off today, obviously are focusing on consumer bank, which makes a lot of sense, right? So retail bank and SME are two areas where you will see a lot of interest. And you will see the solutions making a lot of sense. But within retail also, right now the focus is more on lending. For simpler reasons, one, access to lending is not easily available. It makes a lot of sense even to look at it from a financial inclusion standpoint. But that's not the end game here, right? So typically lending has now become synonymous to some extent to BNPL, right? But that's not the end game here. So from a BaaS standpoint, you are working with partners fundamentally to create an ecosystem where their clients should and would come back to the platforms again and again, and they help build stickiness and more engagement with the platforms. So you can possibly start with products like lending. So in Indonesia, we have two products already, lending and deposits, right? But the scope can expand further into managing the supply chain for the platform, which is the SME piece, and also getting into wealth solutions. And Malaysia is a good example. And that does not mean that that's what we're going to launch today. I'm just giving an example, right? Just for you to understand. So don't misread that as that we could be the first product Stanchart will launch in Malaysia from a BaaS standpoint. Wealth solutioning or wealth awareness in this market is very low. Even today, the most dominant player in this market is an agency force, which is pretty unheard of, right? Even today in this market, if you buy a mutual fund, most people, not all, but most people pay a sales charge of anywhere between 2 to 3%, some even up to 5%. If you go to other markets like India today or Australia, unheard of. It doesn't exist, right? Because awareness is significantly higher, the access is much easier. So this kind of platforms which give you access to millions of clients also makes it easy to engage and educate these clients, because traditional banks struggle with that, right? Somebody was talking about it. If you have $10,000, we'll talk to you potentially. Actually, not even $10,000, right? You have to bring in maybe $100,000, then we'll talk to you for your wealth solutioning and advisory, right? Now, of course, there are platforms which do this in terms of advisory like Starship and stuff, which is great. And that helps expand the market and access, right? But when a bank like Stanchart comes into that space with the kind of credibility and advisory we have, and with the reach of a partner to a BaaS model, that makes it very, very powerful. And that really helps engage the clients and build more, right? So the use cases can be very diverse. It's traditionally lending, retail, but it can go from lending all the way to investments, and you can take the scope all the way to SMEs. Okay. What should you look out for, right? Now, this is something that is, I think, the most crucial part of this conversation, which I would like to share, and this is something we have learned through this journey in multiple markets of working. First, you need to, and this is again something they spoke about during the digital bank piece, right? If you get into a partnership model, it's a bit tricky. It's never a straight line, right? You need to find partners where your objectives are aligned and you're very clear what the partner is expecting out of this partnership and what are you expecting. A simple example could be you could work with any platform who has clients. But if the partner's primary objective, hypothetically, is to say, I want to try and generate and maximize revenue only, right? Tough, to be very practical and honest. Because the space, you're dealing with a very different kind of client segment. Right? But as a partner says, yes, I want to generate revenue, but I also want to make sure that my primary objective is to serve my client's interest well, create more stickiness so they can come back to me and my platform for multiple things. Makes a lot of sense. So in Bukalapak example again, while lending has started, right? And there is a revenue share arrangement in place, the bank benefits, so does Bukalapak as an e-commerce player. The bigger benefit to them is the clients are spending more on the platform. because they do get financing, right? And that's something they are more focused on, which makes a lot of sense. Okay? So having that alignment and clarity of objectives in terms of what you expect as an FI if you're getting into the space and what the partner wants from you or from this partnership is very, very important, very critical. So that's one aspect to keep in mind. The other aspect is roles and responsibilities. Right? So we are a bank. So we know what the regulator expects. We know what the requirements are. We understand risk management. So these are areas where we have to play to our core strengths. We bring the technology into the picture because we play both roles, right? The enabler as well as the provider. But if you are a platform, you also have to be clear that your role will be to help with the client engagement, the UI, UX on which you're way better than what a traditional bank can be. How do you build client journeys which are friction-free, right? That's an expertise we don't have today. We are trying to get there, but it'll take us, I guess, some more time, right? The platforms do that very, very well. So if they could focus on where they are good and bring their strengths to the table, it makes a lot more sense. But having that clarity up front helps a lot. Also, expectation setting on other aspects, right? A simple example, when you work with platforms, you practically are outsourcing activities to them. Example, KYC. Because you want to keep it digital, you want them to do it for you. But KYC standards that apply for banking are significantly stringent compared to what a typical platform would use today to say onboard a wallet. So having that expectation setting clearly aligned to say, hey, no, if today a standard is here, tomorrow it has to be here, we have to agree that we will have to update. Else, you get into conflict later, right? Not only that, early engagement, and which has been a big, big learning for us, and I think that's something you will have to keep in mind if you want to get in the space, with practically all your key stakeholders, regulators, right? Partners, of course, but regulators. Internally with your second line. Extremely critical. So while most regulators, including Malaysia, Bank Negara, are very supportive and open to digital innovation, right? It's new. A lot of things we do are very different, right? We are getting into a space where most clients may not have access or may not have thick bureau files, if you understand lending. You have clients who come with very little data. How do you underwrite them? How do you collect income documentation? How do you build alternate income estimation models, right? Traditional loans start at 1 year going up to 5 years. Here the loan tenors generally end at 1 year. So how do you change the way you look at vintages on risk management? How do you look at outsourcing of KYC? How do you look at outsourcing of collection activities? So there are a lot of things which are new when you get into the space, when you get into this partnership, which the regulator needs to understand. We also need to understand. Our own internal second line needs to understand. So starting early on all these aspects of the conversation, right? Technology. How do you manage client data? Who owns the client data? Who owns the risk in terms of breach, which is a big, big risk in today's day and age. Starting that early helps a lot in building a more robust win-win model when you get into the BaaS space, right? So that's broadly what I want to talk about. So in summary, if anybody is looking at, and that's where I started to advertise a bit about StanChart, looking at becoming a partner in this journey as a platform, speak to us. We are getting into multiple partnerships. We're pretty busy right now in that space, in multiple markets, including Malaysia. If there are smaller banks here who want to adopt our platform, so Calvin has done a brilliant job. He has taken Nexus and spun it off as an independent company called Audix now, right? And the reason he has done that is he doesn't want to restrict the technology solution we built as an IP only to StanChart and StanChart's clients. He's happy to offer it to anybody outside StanChart too, right? And that's a great thing, because the idea is how do we collaborate and do more. So anybody's interested in the space, please speak to us, reach out to us, or anybody in the StanChart world. With that, thank you so much. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take any.
Right, there are a few here that we got 3 questions from online. I guess, well, the first one, pretty simple one, pretty straightforward. I won't say simple, straightforward. Who does Standard Chartered, I guess, see as their target market for banking as a service?
Okay, I don't know how to explain the question. When you say target market, if it's about client base, well, the idea is to scale, right? So this is an initiative, as I mentioned earlier, from a context setting standpoint, is to help us scale up. We have been always focused in most markets in the affluent space, and that's where we are predominantly strong today. What this allows us to do is to scale up into the personal banking space in a much, much bigger way at definitely much lower cost. So if that's what it is. If the question is more in the context of partners, we clearly are working or looking at partners who are platforms, right? Who already have a client base and who have an interest on two fronts. One, obviously, to generate more revenue through their clients and monetize it, but more importantly, who want to build more stickiness on their platforms by adding value to the clients, by adding more products and solutions, because the intent is you want to serve the client more and more at places of their preference or choice, right? So that's what it comes in.
Such as your partnership with Bukalapak.
Yeah.
Given, I guess, the Standard Chartered's heritage in space over 100 years old, 126, was that what you said?
148 in Malaysia.
140. As we enter a more digitalized banking world, what do you guys see as the biggest challenge for banking in a digitalized environment? No pressure at all.
See, it's an evolving space, right? Banking in the last decade or so, since the financial crisis, GFC, then the Asian financial crisis before that, and the latest pandemic, a lot has changed. So if you look at banking in general, one of the biggest changes is around how do you look at risk management, how do you look at capital and stuff like that. And that's evolving. So we started from Basel 1, now we're at Basel 4, right? And we're getting there. So that's one evolution we have to get used to. So banking is no longer a very glamorous industry in that sense. Very important industry, but it's a much tougher industry to be in, and the responsibility levels are much higher. When it comes to technology, it's just trying to keep abreast with what's happening around us, right? Every second day, I'm sure you hear about some kind of scam, data breach. We see reports of how innovative some of these data breaches have become. Extremely intelligent. With things like ChatGPT, while it makes it easy for you to potentially go and do some work, it has made it easy even for the scammers and hackers to hack into your platforms and solutions. And that's an even bigger threat. And that's a constant evolution. So if you ask me if one thing I would worry about today is while we are investing and building technology, which has become cheaper, more accessible and easier, keeping in mind the data risk that comes with it, right? And how do you protect that has become equally important.
One last question here. Does Standard Chartered see a challenge between building out banking as a service and the incoming digital banks? I mean, this big part of our morning has been talking about banking. And I think you gave us a bit of a teaser that you're hopefully trying to launch one before they come in with theirs.
Generally, I'm not known to be very, very diplomatic, but it's okay, I'll try. So we have launched 2 digital banks, like I mentioned, in Hong Kong and Singapore as well, right? So it's not a space we don't understand or we are not familiar with. I guess the good news with any new ventures coming to the space, let it be through BaaS or through digital banks, is the market will expand. And that's our experience in markets where this has pulled through over a span of 5 to 6 years. So we have seen digital banks in Hong Kong for almost 4 years now. We have been there for 4 years now, right? Has it had any material impact on the traditional mother bank of ours? The answer is no. Have we acquired a lot of clients in the digital bank? The answer is yes, right? Standard Chartered alone, or Mox, I think right now, if I remember correctly, is sitting at about 500,000 clients, right? Which is not a small number. What is the overlap between the 2 banks? Pretty small, actually, right? And that's also because, as I mentioned earlier, being a traditional bank, we bank clients who remember Donald Duck, right? The younger population doesn't like us much. They think we're either too old or too atas or whatever, right? Basically, they just don't want to bank with us. So what these ventures do is to help expand the market to some extent. Also, it's great to see innovation in terms of how do you create friction-free journeys? How do you really get people excited about banking? Like I said, nobody wants to go to a banking app. So if any of the digital banks or any new venture does something interesting, exciting, it's great to copy and replicate too. No shame in that, right? But having said that, yes, we do intend and most probably will be launching before the digital banks.
Any questions from the floor before we close off? Going once? Oh, we have one. All right.
Is it not ask questions?
I guess this whole conversation about embedded finance, open banking has been a conversation that's been going on for a while, right? And Bank Negara did issue some guidelines, I think several years back. Given that guideline and recent developments in this space, do you think what we have from the regulators is sufficient to push embedded finance and BaaS forward?
So the simple answer is if we can do more in one area which will really help the industry and the clients, I would say we should look at how do we create a central repository for client data authentication. That doesn't exist in Malaysia. Like you have SingPass in Singapore or you have an Aadhaar card in India, right? That can make a significant difference in terms of how you build friction-free client journeys to get the whole engagement going digitally in the truest sense, right? So Malaysia lacks that today. So there's one area where I would say we should be putting in more energy, more effort to get it going. That would be one area.
Just a quick question. How would you address any perception of conflict of interest where on one hand you're Standard Chartered and on the other hand you're providing technology to other banks?
The company which will provide the technology is called Odex. It is owned by Stanchart, obviously, right? But it's spun off as an independent company with an independent CEO, independent management team. And like any partnership we get into, they would have their respective kind of walls in which they will operate. So if they get into a partnership with an ABC bank, which is not Stanchart, it's between them and that bank. We don't have an oversight on that, right? And banking regulations in terms of secrecy and so on are very significantly high, so you don't have to worry about that. And that's exactly the reason why it was spun off. So if it was part of the bank, internally, yes, that could be a little more challenging because the access to information, the data, the management team is all the same. Now it is totally independent, right? So that's how it makes a big difference.
So now I've learned.
So if you want to talk about that, for example, I wouldn't be talking to you. If you come and say, hey, I'm a bank, hypothetically, right? And I want to get into BaaS and use your technology, so I'm not the person to talk to because I represent Stanchart. If you're a platform, I'll talk to you. If you're a bank, I'll refer you to my buddy, Kelvin Tan, who runs Audax. You'll talk to him directly, and we'll not be involved in that process.